Andrew Jackson operated much of his presence from his bed. I mean, he had a lead bullet put in his chest, and he suffered from mercury poisoning and lead poisoning, and in those days, doctors couldn't treat it. And I can name a young woman myself whom I knew who suffered from mercury poisoning for some 20 years before finally recovering from it. I mean, it's still very difficult to get rid of. Jackson, of course, never did. They didn't have the medicine that we have today. But Jackson, from his bedside, said, "I will get rid of the bank," because to him the bank represented bigness and big business and the rich. So he, when the bank's charter ran out, they sent a new bank, the Congress sent him a bill to renew the charter. Jackson vetoed it. And Jackson, what's that?
This bank war he was talking about,
The Bank of the United States. Yeah, it was called the bank war. He vetoed it. So basically the bank that had been well managed was done away with. And Jackson then began to deal with his money issues through numerous small banks, which were called pet banks. The pet banks, some of them were well managed, but some of them loaned out money too freely to people who were developing the West. Well, Jackson left office after 8 years. He was a very sick man. And he appointed a wealthy man named Martin Van Buren to take office. Martin Van Buren, he had the most unhappy term of presidency of probably any president up to that time. Martin Van Buren, during his inaugural speech, said, "We're going to follow in the footsteps of our illustrious predecessor." And in short order, he took office in 1837. And in short order, that occurred the Panic of 1837. What happened was the banks that had loaned out money, then more money than they could afford to loan out. Folks, this is not the last time it's happened. When most of you are probably still children, in 2008, that's how recent it's been, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac loaned out money to people who could not afford to pay back, and they almost crashed our economy. But also, the economy is more delicate than you realize. Now, for instance, supposing that this were the whole world, and there was only $100 in it, how could I, give you each $100? It's called circulation. Give you $100 first, and you want to do some goods and services to buy some goods services, $100 to you next, $100 to you, $100 to you, and each of you would have $100 at some point, which you'd spend on the next person, and then $100 would wind up back to me, and then I would recirculate it. It's called circulation.
Are you talking about a money pool?
What's that?
Like a money pool?
Somewhat, yeah, the whole world of a money pool. But basically, what circulation is I get my paycheck on Friday. By Monday, it's just about all gone. I mean, but at least somebody else benefits. And then, of course, I'll have another paycheck waiting for me next Friday. And another paycheck waiting for me the Friday after that, hopefully, In actual reality, I only get paid once a month. But at one time, I got paid every Friday. But again, the people who get the money wind up spending it. And so the money goes from one person to another person, and eventually winds up back to you again. That's circulation, but it's very delicate. Supposing someone doesn't get their share and can't spend it, the whole system can come crashing down. And that's part of it. But actually what caused the Panic of 1837 was everybody began to think that the economy is crashing, which it was. So everybody made a run on a bank. That's what the word panic means. Now in those days there was no stock market as such, but the banks worked a lot like stock market. Everybody made a run on the bank and said, "Give us our money." The banks had to close their doors. The banks said, we'll have it. We will promise we're going to have it later. We don't have it now. And again, this was the way loans were done in those days. You paid it back whenever you could. You paid it back by a certain date. You paid it in lump sum. The banks simply didn't have the money. And this created a whole big economic downturn. Unlike the other Panic of 1819, though, the Panic of 1837 was actually blamed on President Martin Van Buren, but today's historians universally blame Andrew Jackson, who was out of office. then this was to happen. Every panic we had from that time until the Great Depression of the 30s, and actually to some extent even after that, the recession of George Bush, George 41, the recession he had cost him the election. And of course, we had another big economic downturn in 2008 that cost Republicans the election. George Bush 43 was not running, but John McCain was, and John McCain lost largely because of the big downturn. But there was an economic downturn late in 2008, right about the election time, that greatly benefited Barack Obama. Anyway, our presidents are still blamed. Of course, more than then, our presidents are expected to be economic experts, and they're rated and judged on how well the economy goes during their time. Well, during the Panic of 1837, the economy went down and stayed down during much of his time. Inflation also became a problem for the first time in history. Not the first time, but basically inflation means that your money is worth less and less. I've already mentioned how that my dad could buy a movie ticket and a bottle of pop and a hot dog for a dime. Those are bygone days. So yeah, the nickel candy bar used to be large, 8 inches long or so. Then they got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Today the nickel candy bar doesn't exist. Martin Van Buren wound up being a one-term president, largely because of the Panic of 1837. He ran for re-election in 1840. In the election of 1840, the new party came on the scene, a party that was against Andrew Jackson. They called themselves the Whigs. Because in England, people who opposed the king were called Whigs because they wore wigs to show which side they were on. In our country, the Whigs did not wear wigs to show which side they were on, but nevertheless, they called themselves Whigs because they opposed King Andrew I. They pictured King Andrew sitting on a throne with a crown on his head and royal robes and a scepter. King Andrew I, they called him. Anyway, in 1840, William Henry Harrison was elected, and it was said that Harrison was drunk and sung into office. It's the first time they used slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tippecanoe was the name of the battle that Harrison had won that made him famous, and John Tyler was his vice president. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. But they had a whole lot of parties, more than before, more than they had in 1836. And the poor people pictured Van Buren as a rich man drinking costly wines in the White House, indifferent to the suffering his misrule had cost. And one Republican later said we were lied down, drunk, well, they probably should change the Democrat. So we were lied down, drunk down, and sung down. But it wasn't altogether that. It was the difficult years that they'd had during the Van Buren's administration that did Van Buren in. Now, there were rumors going around that William Henry Harrison was a very sick man. Here's how Harrison stifled those rumors. He would go on his sick bed secretly in a stagecoach, but he would be lying down in a sick bed the whole time. He'd go to a party, and at a certain point in a party, he would come in crashing the party, and he would whoop it up and laugh it up and holler and scream and make a really short, enthusiastic speech. And as soon as it's over, he'd get back in his bed really fast. This we now know to be true, but he was actually in very, very poor health. But he was a general, and he was supposedly tough, and he could take it. His inaugural speech was made in the rain, and no president has done this since. His speech lasted more than an hour. And he made it in the rain, and but again, he was a general in the army, and he could take it. No, he couldn't. Then once he got in, he immediately worked 18 to 20 hours a day making appointments, because we had a new party, and he wanted to get rid of all the old Democrats, replace them with Whigs. He had the shortest presidency on record. He lasted 1 month, and he was gone, pneumonia. He actually had been sick during the whole campaign, and by not taking care of himself, he guaranteed that his election was going to be short-lived for him. And the big victory turned to ashes. All right, this takes us up to chapter 12. Let's see. Free North and West. All right, yeah, Free North and West, chapter 12. It opens up with a vignette about Abraham Lincoln, how that he married above his class. I've got to say this, there were two of our presidents, and maybe more, who married higher than their class. One of them was James Madison, who was a poor young man who didn't know which way he was going, and married into a high aristocrat, a woman named Dolly Madison. But he married above his class. But in the case of Lincoln, all right, folk, I'm going to be plain with you. Abe Lincoln was quite honestly ugly. Some people, you're not supposed to use that word anymore. All right, I just did, whether I should have or not. Abe Lincoln was highly unattractive to women, and he went one time to what we might today call a single social, where there were a lot of women, and he said, I could not get any lass, that was the word he used for women, I could not get any lass to talk to me. And he said, I finally cornered a lass and got a little bit of a conversation out of her. None of them would have anything to do with him. In the meantime, there was a woman named Mary Todd who said, I'm going to be the president's wife someday. Her father was a plantation owner and a slave holder. Very important to know this, because Abe Lincoln was to wind up... Abe Lincoln was to wind up turning against slavery, but her father was a slave owner, and she was courted by two men, Abe Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, men who later became friends. Anyone would have thought that if she wanted to become the president's wife, she'd better marry Stephen Douglas, because he was up and coming, he was a politician. Abe Lincoln was lanky, his gestures were awkward, he was unattractive. She instead rejected Stephen Douglas and married Abe Lincoln. And guess what? She got to be First Lady. Goes down in history as perhaps the worst First Lady we've ever had, but that's something else. Yeah. But she got to be First Lady, though.
Why so? Why was she the worst?
She developed mental problems. And the issue in her life is, everyone knows, she was sane as a young woman. She was insane as an old woman. Well, when did she become insane? And the answer to that is, it was a slow, gradual process to where you can't put a line and say at this point she was insane. But her son testified that she had been insane because of her husband's death. But really, during the time she was in the White House, she made some decisions that really hurt him, made a dunce out of him. I mean, we could go into more detail. All right. Here's the rumor about what was wrong with her. The word has gotten around that she had syphilis. No, she was not unfaithful to him. She got it from her husband, Abe, who had got it from the town. This word has gotten around, and but it affects different people different ways. In her case, syphilis still causes, folk, and don't let anyone tell you it doesn't, still causes dementia, among other things. And it's still very bad, because the strains going around today are very difficult, in some cases impossible to treat. But anyway, it's believed that she might have had it, and it was his fault if she did. All right. America was growing rapidly in population. The axe became one of the biggest tools in America at the time. It was used to chop down trees. Now, this was before the invention of the two-man saw. If you go to some old farms, you might see the saw that had two handles on each end, and two men would operate that saw, with each of them taking turns going. You had to learn to work as a team. When your buddy was pushing, you had to pull, and then you had to push while the man across from you was pulling. But that was an improvement over the axe. Then, of course, eventually today we have these chainsaws. But in those days, you used axes. They would get the tree down with an axe. Then they would chop up the tree for firewood, but they had to leave the stump, and oftentimes the stump would sit there for a good many years, unable to be moved, because they didn't have bulldozers that could take the stump. So they'd plant their garden between stumps. But they would move west and chop down the trees, plant their gardens, and again, oh yes, you'll see this name also, John Deere.
No way.
D-E-E-R-E. Now,
That's going to John Deere. Right.
you've seen the John Deere tractor, I guess. So John Deere he's of course long dead, but he invented the steel plow. He got rich from it, and eventually his factory that he started was able to become the leader in tractor making. And today they still make tractors, and they've, I believe, resorted to making riding lawnmowers. But John Deere invented the steel plow, and the steel plow was lighter than the iron plow and stronger than the iron plow, and could last longer and do a lot better work than the iron plow. About this time, too, another man named Cyrus McCormick, and no, I'm not going to write that name down. Well, Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper, and you still see the name McCormick on reapers. Essentially, before this time, folk, people would reap wheat by using a scythe. And if you think that was back straining work, it was. I mean, a scythe had a handle halfway down. It was a large sickle, basically. But anyways, some of you might never have used a scythe. Yes, I'd used one when I was younger, cutting down.
Sorry, but kind of like what death has. Yeah, I got that. Sorry.
No, it wasn't a boom. A scythe is a large sickle. I mean, you all put them in the ground, and they would use to cut wheat. But the reaper that McCormick invented had a wheel, like a paddle wheel, that as it turned, I mean, it was pulled by a horse. It didn't have an electric or gas motor or electric motor. It was pulled by a horse, and as a horse turned the wheels that were on the ground, it was geared to where the blades of the reaper moved fast enough to cut the hay. Again, several men tried it, including Cyrus McCormick's father, tried it, and all they could do is just get a bunch of wheat to be sifted around every which way. But McCormick's reaper actually cut the hay and made him fairly wealthy. And again, this device greatly increased the amount of wheat that could be harvested by the farmer. Labor then was scarce. Farmers began to grow more, but they couldn't find workers to work it. So, but you did have a lot of farmers who could not afford land, but they moved to government land. And they would live on, and the government allowed them to do this. They'd go to government land and cut down the trees, plant their crops, so as much as they could plant, as much as they could cut down, and they would live rent-free and build up a log cabin from the logs. And these were squatters, persons who would live on land that they did not own. You don't find that today, by the way, so don't try it. But squatters would live on land that they did not own. And they would stay there maybe for a generation or two. Oftentimes they'd stay there for several years before they would move on. Most of the time when the squatters moved, they moved westward, farther west. The government would encourage settlers to move into territories. Now this was one thing that the Spanish and the Mexicans did not do. When Spain had the territories of Texas and California, they could not get their people to move into these areas, Texas, New Mexico, California, Arizona. They could not get the people to move. Then when Mexico defeated Spain, Mexico could not get its people to move in either. That's ironic because today we're trying to keep them out. But in those days, the Mexican government could not get them to move in. But then came the Yankees, or the Americans, and they moved in droves. Europeans had more laborers than they could use, and a lot of these laborers were unemployed. They didn't have as much land. In the United States, we had lots of land and fewer workers. We needed more workers. Europe had too many workers. Especially with machinery, for the first time in the history of mankind, machines began to make it possible to lay off workers. A man who owned a reaper, or a farmer who owned a reaper, did not need as many workers to cut his wheat. So a lot of workers were sent to find another job, but they could because we had a shortage of workers in this country. Now, at this time, Britain dominated the international market, owing to the fact that British goods were better than American-made goods. Now, folks, that's not true today, but in the 1840s it was true. Britain made better products, better clothing than was made in America, better machinery. Inventions. The number one invention that really helped bolster the economy was the railroad.
What is the Underground Railroad?
The railroad started out, well, they started out putting chains between the cars, and it was found out that when the cars would bump into each other. So they said, we've got to find somewhere to keep these cars apart when the train moves. So they found solid separators that separated one car from another. And still the train could turn on the track. The railroad, you might wonder, why didn't they invent the automobile first? The answer to that is simple. All they had was a steam engine. They tried to make cars with steam, but steam engines are extremely heavy, and it simply was impractical. For one thing, they didn't have power steering, and those steam cars they first built were really, really hard to steer.
The assembly line without later on, Henry Ford,
What's that?
the assembly line.
That was the assembly line was to come about 50 years later down the road with Henry Ford. Yeah, but also for the difference. Steam is an external combustion. That is, the combustion occurs outside the engine, and only less than 10% of the power that's produced actually goes to turning the wheel. Now, with today's automobile engines, 30% or so of the power that's used actually turns the wheel. We have internal combustion engines that are much lighter, but we never did successfully make a good steam automobile. So because the engines were so heavy, they built the railroad, and the railroad became longer and longer and better as steam engines got better. Another invention that came along was the telegraph, invented by Morse.
Samuel Morse.
Samuel F.B. Morse. And it used dots and dashes. Again, but the code he used is not the code that we learn today. Now, being a ham operator, in my younger days, I learned Morse code. Any of you who've ever listened to shortwave radio probably has heard what I just did. What I just gave out was my amateur call sign. My name, John, my first name. Anyway, that's code. Probably all of you should know the International Distress Code is SOS. Yeah, da. S is 3 dots. O is 3 dashes, and then S 3 dots again. SOS. And one time we heard a horn blowing in the middle of a field, and there was some guy who had been racing in a GTO, one of the fast cars. He lost control and rolled over, and he was upside down. But he was able to blow his horn, and he blew an SOS sign and got a bunch of us out of bed. And eventually we got him rescued. But he stayed in the hospital for a month. As far as I know, he survived. But he eventually was, a month later, was released from the hospital. He was pretty badly hurt. We didn't know when we rescued him whether he'd live or not, but he was trapped under the GTO. One male and one female companion were thrown clear. They did not have a seatbelt requirement in those days. He was in the driver's seat and couldn't be thrown clear. But anyway, we heard this SOS call, and we got up out of our beds and responded. Anyway, Samuel Morse. The railroads at first were privately owned. The first railroad that was in commercial use was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It's still in existence. Baltimore and Ohio. And if you ever stop by a train, you'll see some of these roads still there. There's Western Maryland, Baltimore and Ohio, and whatever other kinds of railroads they have. It was an economic boom. Not everybody benefited from it. For instance, women generally did not benefit. A few men were able to climb up the ladder, and among them was Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln got his start by, among other things, marrying above his class and teaching himself, and he became a lawyer. He only had about one year of formal education, so you might say he went through the first grade. But then he taught himself, read every book he could get his hands on, became a lawyer, and eventually became a politician.
Why do most politicians first start off as lawyers?
That is still going on. It's simply that from the field of law, number one, they get to meet a lot of people. They get one of my high schools called exposure. And also, as a lawyer, people respect them more. They think they know the law, and therefore they're capable of making it. They're capable of working it. This is most of your presidents at one time were lawyers. There have been some exceptions, of course. William McKinley was a lawyer. Abraham Lincoln started out as a lawyer. A lot of them started out as lawyers. Some of them were generals, like Grant and Hayes and Garfield and Eisenhower. Some of them were generals.
Some of them are.
Two of them were businessmen. Herbert Hoover and Donald Trump were businessmen. And Herbert Hoover's administration was a disaster, like Martin Van Buren's. The economic downturn and only lasted 4 years. Donald Trump, the issue is still unsettled. I will say this about the presidency. Our founding fathers never meant for them to be career politicians. They expect a man would work at his business or work at his farm, work at his shop, and if it was looked on as being good enough, someday he'd be chosen to be maybe a legislator, maybe a governor. And if he was really, really good at what he did, the electors would pick him to be President of the United States. This was what they envisioned. But a man like Bill Clinton, who with all respects to him was nothing more than a politician, a career politician, started out in politics and got elected to various offices and worked his way up to the presidency. They did not envision this to be what they wanted. They wanted a man, the president, to come from the ranks, an ordinary citizen, and one day, because he's been really successful, we make him president. The only president who has met that category is Donald Trump. Never was in the army, never held office, never was in politics. Each of you can decide for yourself what that might mean to you. All right. Immigrants, between 1840 and 1860, your book says some 4.5 million immigrants arrived. By 1860, foreign-born residents made up 1/8 of the American population. Now, on a personal note, my great-great-grandfather, John Cunningham, came over about 1847. In the censuses, they always would list, is he a foreign birth? Well, in the 1860 census, which I have a copy of, they list John Cunningham as being a foreign, yes, he was a foreign birth. He eventually got to be a citizen. He came over here legally in about 1847 and married an American girl and had a large family. But then in 1900, the census, the next one down, William Wallace Cunningham, named after famous Scotsman William Wallace. He was American born, of course. Father of American birth, the answer to that was yes. No, they wanted to know on the census whether you were of foreign birth or your father. So we have accurate records of who was born in the American, who was of foreign birth. So when the book says that so many people were of foreign birth, that's pretty accurate. 1/8 of the American population was of foreign birth in 1860. Now, 3/4 of these immigrants came from two places, Germany and Ireland. Now, here's what happened in Ireland, folk, and this is about to happen to the banana today. So some of these problems, but in Ireland, some man bought one potato. You're catching this code. Now, any of you know anything about how the way potatoes reproduce? They simply reproduce by sprouting out and growing other potatoes. But they all were this one potato. In other words, now, a blight hit the potatoes in the 1840s. and every potato got it. Because, now, what the solution would have been if somebody would have enough sense to bring over other potatoes that might not have been affected with this blight. Maybe Ireland could have survived. As it was, the potato blight hit Ireland, and in Europe, while every country in Europe was in